The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My chance to speak in this House of Commons whenever we talk about the deployment of the men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces into a combat or combat-related mission is one of the most important debates we have in this House, and certainly as someone that served in the military, it's something I take very seriously, and I was proud to speak on October 7th of last year, Mr. Speaker, on the mission against ISIL when the Prime Minister first brought it to this House. And now I speak in a very unique role as well, Mr. Speaker, as the Minister of Veterans Affairs, recognizing that when we send our men and women into areas of the world like this, there are risks. And I think of those risks and I think of those people, those moms and dads who are serving their country, those sons and daughters, people like Sergeant Andrew Doiron and his comrades who in their training mission encountered friendly fire, and just shows the risks and uncertainty when we send the Canadian Armed Forces. And we send them because they are professional and are amongst the best in the world, Mr. Speaker. And as Minister of Veterans Affairs, I'm not just proud of them, I'm here to assure those men and women and their families that we will serve them after their deployments and after they leave uniform. And I think back to the October 7th, and I look back at my speech, Mr. Speaker, to see where we've come as a country and as one of the allies fighting the ISIL movement worldwide, and what has happened since October 7th. And I read the Prime Minister's speech to this House, and it's important because we're bringing this debate and a vote to this House, unlike the Liberal Party before the 12-year Afghanistan mission. The Prime Minister in October of last year said, "It's never been the Canadian way to do only the most easy and praiseworthy of actions and leave the tougher jobs to other nations. Our country has always had a proud history of playing a role commensurate with our size and ability. That's what we've been asked to do here alongside our allies like the United States and others, and that's what we're doing with professionalism, Mr. Speaker." And let's look at the world, and indeed Canada, since the first debate in this House in October of last year. We're now renewing the mission because we've taken very concrete timelines that we're monitoring the impact of our mission to degrade and restrain ISIL from their advance and to halt their activities of barbarism in that part of the world, Mr. Speaker. What have we seen since October? We've seen attacks in the Middle East, terrorism attacks in Africa, Europe, and here in Canada, Mr. Speaker. We've seen the rise of the foreign fighter phenomenon, Mr. Speaker, which last year the estimates of 20,000 foreign fighters joining the ISIL mission in that part of the world, 500 or more from Great Britain, from Germany, over 1,000 from France. We've seen Canadians, Mr. Speaker. I think we've been troubled by the fact that there are Canadians who have been misled, who have been swept into this global jihadi movement, who are actually traveling there to commit these atrocious acts. That gives us a further responsibility, Mr. Speaker, as a leading nation of the world, to not ignore what is happening. There has also been progress, Mr. Speaker. Sergeant Doiron, the CSOR Regiment, our F-18 squadrons, our Aurora crews, our Polaris crews, Canada and our allies are making a profound impact, Mr. Speaker. Religious minorities have been protected. There are refugees leaving these areas where their lives are at risk. We have degraded ISIL, and we have constrained them out of large parts of Iraq that they were essentially overrunning last year. But there's still progress to make, Mr. Speaker. There are still inherent risks with allowing a terrorist force who has as their mission to create a state and to execute and encourage attacks throughout the world. Canada is not immune, Mr. Speaker. We've seen that. We've seen that in this city, Mr. Speaker. So therefore, we have a responsibility to play an active role. And I'm proud when the Prime Minister also highlights our leadership on the humanitarian aid side of this mission, Mr. Speaker, because you can't divorce the subject of refugees and aid from the fact that we need to bring security and safety to that region. Just this week in the House, the Prime Minister said, "We don't choose between fighting terror or helping its victims." Canada will continue to do both. We are providing some of our world-class expertise from the Canadian Armed Forces, Mr. Speaker. but we're also one of the lead nations in aid, one of the lead nations responding in the refugee crisis, and we will continue to do that, Mr. Speaker. In my speech on October 7th, I said debates like this define the very character of Canada. Le fait que nous avons l'opportunité d'avoir ce débat fait partie de nos valeurs canadiennes, des valeurs qu'on doit défendre. A debate like this also calls for a Churchill quote, Mr. Speaker, because there's a leader that many parliamentarians from around the world look to. And Churchill, in debates like this, would say, let's worry less about action, but worry more about inaction, to paraphrase Winston Churchill. And our government is making deliberate and measured action against a threat, not just in that region, but a threat to the world and to stability, Mr. Speaker. It's measured in that we're back debating a timeline of this deployment. We're also in a limited combat role where our fighter aircraft can degrade and pin down ISIL. We're doing a training mission to help the Iraqis and the Peshmerga defend their own territory, give them the tactical knowledge to help them defend against the atrocities. So it's a limited, measured, and temporal mission, Mr. Speaker, that we're bringing to our Parliament to debate. One of the most troubling parts of the debate in October, Mr. Speaker, and indeed this week, is the sad position of the Liberal Party of Canada, Mr. Speaker. In fact, it's a deviation from the traditional approach of that party to Canada's position in world affairs, and it's troubling. In my speech last October, I quoted Mackenzie King in 1939 in this place, who, when responding in thanks to the Conservative leader, Robert Mannion, a Vimy Ridge veteran, Mr. Speaker, thanking him for taking the politics out of the debate towards World War II, King said there's a deep-lying instinct for freedom. And I believe that this is a characteristic of the citizens of Canada from one end of this great country to the other. That's Mackenzie King in this place, Mr. Speaker, thanking the opposition for supporting Canadian involvement against tyranny. Lester Pearson, Mr. Speaker, in 1951, another leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. What did he say around the era of Canada in Germany as part of the Cold War, the Korean mission? Pearson said, "We should accept without reservation the view that the Canadian who fires his rifle in Korea or on the Elbe is defending his home as surely as if he was firing it on his own soil." These are not foreign acts that we can ignore, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, Canadian interests, Canadian security is inherent in what's happening across the world. Even in 2001, following 9/11, the Foreign Affairs Minister for the Liberal government and Deputy Prime Minister John Manley, in that very foyer, Mr. Speaker, after 9/11, said Canada has a good reputation in the world, but let's make no mistake about it. Canada does not have a history as a pacifist or a neutralist country. Canada has soldiers who are buried all over Europe because we fought in defense of liberty, Mr. Speaker. 3 quotes from 3 generations of Liberal leaders in Canada, Mr. Speaker. What will historians look back to this Liberal leader's profound quote in defense of liberty? Would it be, this is not about whipping out our CF-18s to show how big they are? Mr. Speaker, it's sad. The Liberal Party has disappeared to what most Canadians knew that proud party to be, Mr. Speaker. Even their defense critic today criticized what she called the laundry list of atrocities that were trotting out being conducted by ISIL. This is what we're fighting, Mr. Speaker. Canada doesn't let a laundry list be read like that and say that it's not our mission, Mr. Speaker. We have no role there. We're a proud country that benefits from globalization, that benefits from trade, that gives aid and helps it on a humanitarian basis around the world, and we're doing that, Mr. Speaker. But we also don't shirk away from our responsibility to play a role that's commensurate with our size and ability, Mr. Speaker. And I'm very proud of the men and women of the Royal Canadian Air Force. I'm very proud of our all uniformed figures in the operations centres working with our allies, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud of our soldiers from our JTF2 and CSOR units, Mr. Speaker, who are giving the tools to some of the people on the ground to prevent these atrocities. Canada has a role to play, Mr. Speaker. Our party, our government is bringing this to the House of Commons to show Canada that this is an important debate, an important role. I truly hope that those in the Liberal Party remind their leader of his responsibility in that regard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Northwest Territories.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and glad to have an opportunity to stand on and ask my colleague a question on. He spoke very strongly at the end about how he sees this is Canada has a role to play. Canada could have many roles to play. This is a role that the Conservative Party has chosen to play in this conflict. We're going to play a role. It's my understanding the conflict in Syria and Iraq is moving into the urban centers. We're going to be playing a role in which our airplanes, without guidance from allied sources, are going to be bombing urban centers. What that's going to lead to, Mr. Speaker, is civilian casualties. That is the role that Canada is taking on with this conflict right now. This is a role that I don't think is appropriate for Canada right now. I think Canada can do much better in the field of humanitarian effort. How does my colleague feel about the situation that's going to occur when Canadian airplanes are causing civilian casualties throughout that region?
The Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the Northwest Territories for that question and remind him of what I quoted from the Prime Minister's two speeches in this House on this mission, where he said, we will do both. Just this week, Mr. Speaker, we will not only try and contain and destroy a terrible force that's causing risk to Canada and to that region, but we're also going to help the victims affected by ISIL. This is not an either-or debate. We are doing as much on a humanitarian level as a leading nation, both giving and assisting, as well as playing a critical role in the security debate. And I would note, Mr. Speaker, in my remarks I said, the Royal Canadian Air Force, through its Aurora observation aircrafts, the Polaris refueling our CF-18s, we have the most modern and well-trained Air Force in the world. And in conducting an air mission like this to contain and destroy ISIL, to cut off its supply lines, we analyze every mission, Mr. Speaker. Nothing goes if there's risks of collateral damage to civilians, Mr. Speaker. Only an Air Force of our professionalism can do that, where they can actually assess targets and then learn from each strike, Mr. Speaker. And the sincere hope, as the Minister of National Defence said, once we degrade and destroy them to the point, our exit strategy is called a flight plan back to Canada.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Vancouver Quadra.
Mr. Speaker, I was quite surprised that in that laundry list of examples of past prime ministers, the minister left out Prime Minister Jean Chrétien and his decision not to take Canada into the war in Iraq in 2003. A decision that his own leader, current Prime Minister, strongly supported going into that war, with arguments based on the very provocative kind of rhetoric and not reason that is being used by the talking points in the Conservative members today, and a decision that proved to be disastrous and the ground for the very chaos and terrorism that's happening in that country today. So when I hear from the member about his experience in the armed forces, I do wonder what he would do if he had leaders that are doing what the two ministers are doing, where one minister is saying that the goal is to degrade ISIL and the other is to destroy and eliminate ISIL. These are two very different objectives. How would that member respond to having very different objectives from leaders when he was in the armed forces? And would that not give him concern that perhaps that is not in his interest to follow those very conflicting and unfuzzy directions?
Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm quite shocked the Liberal defence critic accuses me of using talking points here today, Mr. Speaker. My talking points were actually how previous Liberal leaders talked. I quoted 3 generations of leaders of the once proud Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker, Mackenzie King, Lester Pearson, and John Manley, who was Jean Chrétien's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Speaker. They knew Canada had a role to play in the world. In fact, Mr. Manley became the Time magazine newsmaker of the world essentially for that remark he made, showing that Canada would respond, and we responded by going into Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker, to stop the gathering threat that was being perpetrated through the Taliban, allowing terrorists to trade in that country. And what's interesting, Mr. Speaker, that might not be in her talking point, Jean Chrétien didn't bring that to a debate here or vote in the House of Commons. He used his executive power to deploy Canada for what ended up being a 12-year mission, Mr. Speaker. So the stark difference between the talking points, which were really the speeches of Liberal leaders of the past, and the current one shows the decline and shows how the Liberal Party is out of touch with Canadians.